Ever had one of those days where everything goes wrong and you think, okay, this is officially the worst? Yeah, a medieval peasant would probably laugh in your face. Back in the days of kings, castles, and dragon stories told by candlelight, ordinary people were living lives so harsh and intense, they'd make your bad day look like a spa weekend. Imagine a world where about 90% of people didn't have what we consider the absolute basics. No electricity, no running water, no hot shower after work, no food delivery when you're too tired to cook. Just you, your family, and whatever you could grow, make, or trade with your neighbors. And these people were tough. Not hit the gym 3 times a week tough. I mean tough in a way most of us can't even wrap our heads around. While we're over here checking our step count and feeling proud about 8,000 steps, medieval peasants were doing full-body, all-day workouts. Every single day. For their entire lives. No personal trainers, no rest days, no protein shakes. Just back-breaking labor from dawn to dusk, because if they stopped, they didn't eat. But here's the twist. They weren't sitting around complaining about how miserable everything was. They still found ways to enjoy life. They built tight-knit communities where everyone knew everyone. They shared stories, jokes, songs, and food when they could. Their social lives would probably put a lot of our lonely, glued to the phone evenings to shame. Think about it. When was the last time your whole neighborhood got together for a feast? Not just a group chat or a shared discount code on the same delivery app. The key to surviving as a medieval peasant was resourcefulness. You couldn't just run to a convenience store because you were out of something. There was no supermarket, no Amazon, no add to cart. If you needed it, you grew it, made it, fixed it, or bartered for it. Life was basically set to permanent, extreme survival mode. Except there was no camera crew, no prize at the end, and no going back to a comfy apartment after a few days. This was just life. Now that we've set the scene for how hard things already were, let's talk about their actual work. Because medieval peasants didn't just work hard. They lived inside work. A normal day started before the sun even thought about coming up. In winter, that might mean rolling out of bed around 7 a.m., which doesn't sound too terrible. But in summer, try 4 a.m., alarms. No snooze button, no soft wake-up playlist, just get up or get left behind. And unlike most modern jobs, there was no such thing as one role. A peasant didn't just say, "Oh, I'm a farmer," and call it a day. They had to do everything. Farmer, carpenter, shepherd, blacksmith, builder, basic vet. Sometimes even their own version of plumber and roofer. You know that phrase, jack of all trades? Medieval peasants were the original definition. If they didn't know how to do something, they had 2 options: learn fast or go hungry. There was no handyman to call, no specialist to hire, and definitely no YouTube tutorial to watch. Their work followed the rhythm of the farming year, and every season came with its own set of brutal tasks. Spring was all about ploughing and planting, and it was nothing like you might picture today. No shiny tractor, no air-conditioned cab, no podcast in your ear, just a heavy wooden plough dragged by a couple of oxen across thick, stubborn soil. The peasant's job was to walk behind, forcing that plough into the ground and keeping it straight, step after step, hour after hour. Here's a fun little detail. On heavy soil, it could take about 8 oxen working together to plough just 1 acre in a day. Lose an ox, and you weren't just a bit inconvenienced. It was like losing your car, your job, and your main piece of farm equipment all at once. That animal was your engine, your tractor, your paycheck, and your survival rolled into one. Then came summer. And if you think that meant things calmed down, not even close. From sunrise to sunset, peasants were out in the fields, dealing with one of their worst enemies, weeds. There were no chemical sprays, no weed killer, no fancy tools, just hands, basic iron tools, and a lot of time. One small patch of weeds could destroy a harvest, so they had to go, one by one. Pull, bend, for hours. If your back hurts just listening to this, you're not alone. On top of weeds, there were pests, birds, insects, anything that wanted a free snack. Since there were no modern pest control options, peasants had to get creative. In some places, kids would be hired to run through the fields, clapping, yelling, and waving their arms to scare away birds. That was basically the medieval version of a summer job. No air fryer, no free staff meal, no salary, just running around shouting at crows so your village didn't starve. And yet, Despite this rough setup, medieval peasants were not clueless about farming. Far from it. They actually developed clever techniques that still shape agriculture today. One of the most impressive was crop rotation. Long before scientists could explain the chemistry happening in the soil, peasants figured out that they couldn't keep planting the same crop in the same field year after year. So they came up with a system. Wheat one year, barley the next, then maybe a year where the field was left empty, or fallow, to recover. No lab, no soil testing, just observation, memory, and trial and error. In a way, they were early agricultural scientists, just without the lab coats and PowerPoint slides. Then came autumn, and this was when things got really serious. Harvest time. If the harvest failed, people didn't just eat cheaper food, they starved. So, when the crops were ready, every single able-bodied person in the village was expected to work. Men, women, teenagers, sometimes even kids who could handle smaller tasks. Everyone out in the fields, racing against the weather, the shortening days, and the constant fear of losing everything to one early storm. The main tool for harvesting grain was the sickle, a small, curved blade you swung in smooth, repetitive motions to cut handfuls of stalks. Sounds simple, but doing it wrong meant sliced hands or ruined crops. Studies suggest a skilled worker could cut about an acre of wheat in a day. Not bad until you hear the next part. To pull that off, they had to make around 15,000 separate cutting motions. 15,000. In one day, with your back bent and your arms burning. All that constant strain had a price. Archaeologists, examining medieval skeletons, have found that most peasants showed signs of arthritis by their mid-30 seconds. Imagine being 35 and having a body that feels like it's 80. It makes sense though. When you've basically been doing intense physical labor since childhood, your joints don't stay friendly for long. Their lives were like a non-stop, compulsory CrossFit class that started when you were 6 and never really ended. You might think, well, at least winter gave them a break, right? Not really. Winter didn't mean rest. It just meant a different type of work. This was when peasants had to fix everything that had broken during the rest of the year. Tools, fences, roofs, animal pens, storage sheds. If something was cracked, leaking, or falling apart, winter was your only real chance to repair it before the next cycle of work began. On top of that, animals still needed daily care. That meant trudging through cold, mud, or snow to feed them, water them, and clean out their shelters. Indoors, winter turned into project season. People spun wool, twisted rope, repaired clothes, made candles, sharpened blades, and tried to stretch what little food they had left. And then there was threshing grain, the deeply unglamorous job of separating the edible part of the grain from the husk. Picture this. You're standing in a cold, badly ventilated barn for hours, swinging a flail and beating piles of wheat, dust everywhere, arms aching, ears ringing. It's like the worst drum circle in history, but if you quit early, your family doesn't eat. So no, medieval peasants didn't get weekends. They didn't get vacations. Their whole year was one long loop of physical labor and survival tasks. And yet, somehow, they still managed to create communities, traditions, celebrations, and systems of support that kept them going. And that's where things start to get really interesting. For all that constant grinding work, there is one thing that surprises a lot of people. Medieval peasants actually had more official days off than most modern office workers. Their year was shaped by the church calendar. Sundays were already set aside as days of rest from fieldwork. But on top of that you had feast days, saints' days, and big religious festivals, when ordinary labor was not supposed to happen. Add them all up, and it comes to a pretty shocking number. Some estimates put it at close to 150 days in a year, where regular farm work was limited or stopped altogether. Now, that does not mean they were kicking back on a beach somewhere. Those days often involved walking to church, standing through long services, joining processions, or helping with communal activities. But compared to the non-stop grind people imagine, their working year had a lot of built-in pauses. Harvest time and planting season were brutal, but then a string of feast days could break up the monotony and give everyone a chance to catch their breath. Another thing that kept people going was how cooperative village life was. Work was not just an individual thing, it was very communal. When it was time to bring in the grain, everyone who could swing a tool was out there, side by side. Families helped each other mend fences, build barns, and repair tools. If one household fell behind because someone got sick or injured, neighbors stepped in. They also had a strong culture of mutual help. If one family lost an ox, another might lend theirs for ploughing time, trusting that the favour would be returned one day. Shared labour was not just kindness, it was a survival strategy. A single bad year could topple a household, but an entire village working together stood a better chance of getting through bad harvests, storms, or unexpected disasters. Within this world of farming and shared work, some people developed extra skills on top of basic field labour. Not everyone was only a crop grower. There were villagers who became known for specific crafts or trades that everyone else depended on. You might have a beekeeper who managed hives and produced honey and beeswax. Honey was one of the few sweeteners available, and beeswax made excellent candles, so that person was pretty important. Someone else might specialize in brewing ale, turning grain into something safe and pleasant to drink. Then there was the blacksmith, who was absolutely essential. This was the person who repaired tools, made nails, fixed plough parts, and shod horses. Think about that for a moment. Every nail in every building had to be made one at a time. A skilled village blacksmith could turn out dozens and dozens in a single day, each one hammered by hand on an anvil, heated and shaped in a simple forge. Those nails, hinges, and metal fittings were the hidden hardware holding the entire community together. All that effort burned a huge amount of energy, and that raises a big question. What did people actually eat to keep going? The average peasant diet was not glamorous, but it was surprisingly high in calories. People doing heavy physical labor every day needed fuel. Many likely took in around 2,000 to 3,000 calories daily, sometimes more in busy seasons. The problem was not always the amount of food, but the quality and variety. Bread was the star of the table. Not fluffy white bread like a modern bakery loaf, but heavy, dark loaves made from coarse grain. Wheat if you were lucky, more often barley, rye, or a mix of whatever was available. An adult could easily eat 2 or 3 pounds of bread in a day. It was filling, but it came with a hidden downside. Grinding grain on stone mills meant that tiny fragments of stone ended up in the flour. Over time, that grit acted like sandpaper on people's teeth. Skeletons from rural graveyards often show worn-down tooth surfaces. So when people say medieval bread was rough, that is not just about flavour. Their jaws literally paid the price for every bite. As for drinks, the most common everyday beverage was something called small beer. This was a very weak, low-alcohol ale that even children drank. Water was often unsafe, especially near settlements where waste and animals contaminated streams and wells. Boiling liquid during brewing killed many harmful germs, so small beer actually became a safer daily drink than plain water. Imagine parents telling kids to drink your beer. It is better for you than water. That was normal. Food followed a strict social ladder. Nobles got the choicest cuts of meat and the rarest treats. Peasants got what was left behind. That usually meant organ meats, scraps, bones, and pieces that might be ignored on a modern menu. Meat was precious, and nothing went to waste. Most days, the main dish was something called pottage. Picture a thick, stew-like mix made from peas, beans, grains, and whatever vegetables were in season. On a good day, it might have a few slivers of meat or some fat added for flavour. On lean days, it was just plants and broth. Families kept one pot going for days at a time, adding new ingredients as they became available. It was like an ever-changing, never-ending stew sitting over the fire. When things were going well, peasants might get bacon, dried pork, or a bit of fresh meat from a slaughtered animal. Those moments were often tied to special occasions like religious festivals, weddings, or harvest celebrations. Imagine waiting weeks or months for a taste of something richer than the usual beans and bread. That bite of salted pork or roasted bird would have felt like a festival on a plate. When an animal was finally killed, every usable part was eaten. Heads, feet, organs, skin, fat. If it could be chewed or boiled down, it was food. That was not just frugality, it was smart survival. In a world where one bad season could leave you hungry, throwing away edible parts made no sense at all. Because nature could be brutal, people became experts at preserving food. Salting was one of the most common methods. Meat or fish packed in salt could last for months. Smoking was another. Hanging meat over slow fires, dried it out, and infused it with smoke, protecting it from rot. Vegetables and cabbage could be chopped and fermented into tangy, preserved dishes that stayed edible all winter. Grains, beans, and peas were dried rock hard and stored in sacks or jars, ready to be soaked and cooked later. Those preservation methods could mean the difference between surviving winter or facing an empty pantry. Some dried foods have turned up in archaeological digs centuries later, still recognizable in shape. That gives a sense of how well medieval storage methods worked when done properly. Even with all that effort, there were times when things went badly. A string of cold summers, too much rain, or a plant disease could wipe out crops across a region. In those years, hunger was not a distant fear. It was immediate and deadly. People stretched their supplies to the limit, watered down pottage, and ate whatever they could find. There are chilling stories about desperate measures during these crises. People scraping bark from trees, boiling roots that were normally left alone, chewing old leather just to feel like something was in their stomach. Bakers had to lock up their ovens because people were so hungry they tried to grab dough before it was baked. In extreme cases, entire villages lost a significant portion of their population. Layered on top of natural hardship were religious food rules. Certain days required people to avoid meat and eat fish instead. That was easy enough near the coast or rivers. But for inland peasants, real fish could be rare. So people got creative. Some animals that spent a lot of time in water, like beavers, were treated as acceptable substitutes. There were even strange debates about birds that were believed to have unusual origins, leading to some very flexible interpretations of what counted as fish. Fasting days added another challenge. On those days, people were supposed to eat only one full meal and avoid animal products. Instead of giving up entirely, they came up with clever workarounds. Almond milk became a popular stand-in for cow milk. Cooks invented imitation dishes that looked like eggs or cheese but were made from ground nuts and spices. The amount of time it took to prepare some of these recipes was enormous, especially without modern tools, but the creativity is impressive. The physical effects of this cycle of plenty and shortage show up in the skeletons left behind. Children who lived through severe food shortages often show signs of growth, stopping for a period and then starting again. Bones kept a record of those hard times. Adults were generally shorter on average than many people today, partly because of childhood malnutrition and the heavy strain of constant labor. Despite all of that, when food was available, people knew how to celebrate it. Harvest gatherings turned into days of feasting, music, and relaxation. Everyone brought something, however small, and the simple fact that there was enough to go around turned those gatherings into powerful explosions of joy. In a life shaped by risk, hunger, and hard work, those moments of shared plenty became some of the brightest memories people carried with them. People often picture the Middle Ages as a world of towering castles and grand stone halls, but most people did not live anywhere near that kind of comfort. The typical peasant home was simple, cramped, and very alive in ways that would probably shock anyone used to modern apartments. Imagine a house smaller than many studio apartments, often around 400 square feet in total. That space was not just for parents and kids. Chickens, maybe a goat, and sometimes even a pig shared that living area. This was not just because people loved animals. Keeping them indoors protected them from thieves and harsh weather, and the animals actually helped keep the place warm. The way these houses were built was surprisingly clever. Instead of brick or concrete, many used a method called wattle and daub. Think of it as building a giant basket wall, then plastering it with mud. Workers would weave thin branches together into panels, almost like making a fence out of sticks. Then they covered it with a thick mix of clay, straw, and animal droppings. Once it dried, it hardened into a sturdy, weather-resistant wall. It sounds strange, but tests on reconstructed houses show that this technique created walls that could last for decades with regular care. If a section cracked, you did not need a contractor. You just slapped more fresh daub into the gap. Cheap materials, simple tools, and a lot of hands made an entire village appear piece by piece. The ground inside was usually not covered with boards or stone. Most floors were just compacted earth. To make that more comfortable, people spread reeds or rushes on top, sometimes mixed with herbs to freshen the smell. At first, it probably felt soft underfoot. Over time, crumbs, ashes, and dirt settled into it. Instead of clearing everything away, families often added fresh layers on top. Archaeologists digging into old house sites have found stacked layers of these floor coverings, like pages in a history book, each one packed with tiny clues about daily life. Above their heads, the roof was usually thatched with straw or reeds. Thick layers of plant material kept rain out and heat in surprisingly well. It worked a bit like natural insulation. The downside was that the roof also became home to mice, birds, and insects. You might be trying to sleep while something scratched, chirped, or wriggled just a few feet above your head. There was another detail that made these houses very different from what people are used to today. In many small homes, there was no chimney. The cooking fire burned in a simple hearth, and smoke drifted up into the open roof space before slowly escaping through gaps in the thatch or small vents. Until it left, that smoke filled the room. Eyes watered, clothes absorbed the smell, and lungs took in the haze day after day. Oddly enough, that smoky fog had a benefit. The smoke treated the thatch, discouraging insects and slowing decay. It also helped preserve meat and other foods hung from the rafters. So while it made breathing uncomfortable, it gave the building and its contents a longer life. Windows, at least the kind we think of, were rare. Glass panes were expensive and far beyond the budget of typical farming families. Openings in the walls let in light and air, but those had to be blocked in bad weather. People used wooden shutters, bits of oiled cloth, or leather stretched over frames to keep out the wind and rain. In winter, gaps might be stuffed with straw or old fabric to trap what little warmth there was. Once the sun went down, the inside of a peasant house dimmed quickly. Candles made from beeswax were valuable, and usually reserved for churches or wealthier households. In villages, people often used rushlights. These were made from reeds soaked in animal fat. They burned with a small, smoky flame that barely lit a room. Nighttime activities were limited by that lack of light. Many tasks moved toward daytime hours simply because you could not see well enough after dark. Furniture was minimal, partly because wood cost time and effort to shape. There might be a single table, a few benches, and a chest for storing clothing and important items. That chest could be one of the most valuable pieces in the home. It might hold the family's best garments, documents, and small treasures like coins or jewelry. Sleeping arrangements were simple and crowded. Instead of spring mattresses, people lay on sacks filled with straw or dried leaves. In colder months, family members often shared sleeping spaces to stay warm. Parents, children, sometimes grandparents, and even guests might sleep in the same area. Privacy in the modern sense simply did not exist. Voices from next door could be heard through thin walls. Daily life took place in front of others. Arguments, jokes, and conversations passed easily from one corner of the village to another. That lack of privacy had an upside. It made community life intense and tightly connected. People knew who was sick, who needed help, who was preparing for a wedding, and who had just lost a loved one. News traveled quickly without any written announcements. Word of mouth and sharp observation carried everything from gossip to serious warnings. Step outside one of these houses, and you would see that most villages were not just random clusters of buildings. Many followed practical patterns shaped by the land and local traditions. Houses often stood near each other, sometimes forming rows or small clusters facing a shared open space. That open patch, known as the village green, could serve many purposes at once. Animals grazed there, children played, people gathered for announcements, markets, or simple conversations. Paths wound between houses, barns, gardens, and small sheds. In some places, narrow lanes led from the village centre out to the fields. Those fields were often divided into long strips, shared among different families. Instead of each farmer having one big square, a household might have several narrow pieces scattered across the landscape. That arrangement spread risk. If one strip of land had bad soil or got hit by a storm, another strip in a different spot might still produce a good crop. Water sources also shaped settlement patterns. A stream, well, or pond, was often at the heart of the community. People drew water, washed tools, and sometimes watered animals there. It was not a clean, separate system like modern plumbing, but it was a crucial lifeline. Villages without a nearby water source struggled to survive. Behind many homes, small gardens provided vegetables, herbs, and maybe a few fruit trees. These household plots were essential. They supplied onions, cabbages, leeks, and other plants that turned a bare pot of grain into something more filling and nutritious. Herbs served both for flavor and basic healing. A simple patch of land behind the house could make the difference between bland survival food and something that felt more like a meal. Waste did not disappear into pipes or trucks. Each household had its own solution, usually in the form of a midden heap. This was a small garbage mound where broken pottery, bones, ash, and scraps went. It might not have smelled great, but over time it turned into a rich source of information for people digging centuries later. Layers of discarded material show what people ate, what they used, and even which animals lived around them. Living so close together, with thin walls and shared spaces, meant that everyday problems turned into shared issues. A broken fence could let animals wander into a neighbor's garden. A smoky fire might irritate everyone nearby. A loud argument drew an instant audience. Local disputes often ended up being settled by village elders or by formal gatherings at the manor, because everyone had seen or heard at least part of the story. Maintenance of homes and shared structures was a constant need. Roofs needed fresh thatch, walls needed patching, tracks and bridges needed repairs. Instead of hiring outside contractors, the community itself organized the work. When a roof needed replacing, relatives and neighbors showed up with ladders, bundles of straw, and spare hands. People shared tools and skills. After the job, a simple meal and some ale turned the hard labor into a social occasion. That blend of rough conditions and strong cooperation defined daily living spaces. The houses were smoky, crowded, and basic, but they were also warm centers of family and community. For the people who lived in them, those spaces were not miserable cages. They were home. Step out of a small village house, and you walked into a world full of obligations, rules, and power games that shaped every part of life. The fields and lanes around a rural community were not just open spaces, they belonged to someone higher up the ladder, and that person expected payment in all sorts of creative ways. Most peasants lived under a system where land was controlled by a lord. In exchange for the right to farm strips of land, families owed labor, goods, or money. It was like being signed up for a subscription that you never agreed to, could not cancel, and had inherited from your parents. From the moment a child was born, that child was expected to become part of this daily grind. A large share of whatever the land produced did not stay with the people who worked it. A landlord could claim a significant portion of grain, hay, and animals each year. Imagine handing over a big chunk of your harvest, then watching someone else store it in their own barns. On top of that, there might be special demands, like providing the first loaf of bread from each baking or giving up the best portion of a slaughtered animal. Even small necessities could be controlled. In some places, people were not allowed to freely gather fallen wood from the Lord's forests. Picking up too much fuel could get you in trouble, because firewood was another resource under strict control. There are records of peasants being fined for collecting more wood than they were permitted, or trapping animals on land technically owned by their lord. Wild creatures like rabbits and deer belonged to the landowner, not the people actually living in the valley or forest. Movement was also restricted. Many families were legally tied to their village soil. If someone wanted to leave for another settlement, they often needed formal permission. That might mean paying a fee or performing extra work. Marrying a person from a different community could involve another payment. Even choices about love and marriage were tangled up with land obligations and rights. All of this was overseen by local courts that handled the everyday realities of life. These courts were not grand, distant institutions. They might meet in a hall, out in an open yard, or near a church. Villagers gathered, officials listened, and cases were heard that ranged from serious issues to surprisingly petty complaints. The records of these hearings paint a vivid picture. Someone might be fined for letting their pigs wander through a neighbor's garden. Another case might involve a man who got in trouble for taking fish from a stream that technically belonged to the Lord. One person might be punished for getting too loud while brewing ale, because the noise bothered others. Even gossip could land people in front of the bench. Speaking too freely about someone's reputation was risky if the wrong ears heard it. Punishments took several forms. Fines were common, especially for people who could pay them. Money, grain, or animals changed hands as penalties. For those with fewer resources, more public forms of punishment appeared. Stocks were a simple but effective method. A person's head and hands were locked into a wooden frame in a public area. They were stuck there while others walked by, stared, shouted, or tossed scraps. There were also special seats and contraptions designed to dunk someone into water as a humiliation. These penalties were not just about the individual. They reminded everyone else what happened when rules were broken. Villagers watched, laughed, whispered, or shook their heads, and a message spread without anyone writing it down. Despite all this, peasants were not completely without rights. People could bring their own complaints before the court, even against those who outranked them. The evidence suggests that these cases sometimes ended in favor of the lower-ranked party. That meant the system, even with all its unfairness, had moments when ordinary people could push back. Women appeared in these records too. They were not silent background figures. Some stood as plaintiffs, asking for debts to be paid or property disputes to be settled. Others were defendants, accused of breaking local rules or causing trouble. Their presence in the documents reveals a more nuanced picture of village life than simple stereotypes allow. Justice did not depend solely on slow hearings either. Villages used something known as the hue and cry. If someone witnessed a crime like a theft or a violent attack, they were supposed to shout and alert everyone nearby. Whoever heard that cry was legally expected to join in and help chase the offender. Imagine a whole group of people dropping what they were doing to sprint across fields after a suspected thief, all because one person started yelling. Ignoring that call could itself lead to punishment. If someone stayed put when others were running, they risked being fined. So people not only watched each other, they also had to physically support the effort to keep order. It turned crime fighting into a sort of wild group activity, with real consequences for anyone who did not participate. The legal system even extended to animals in strange ways. There are recorded trials where animals were treated like human defendants. If a pig injured someone, that pig might be seized, brought to a form of court, and sentenced. In especially unusual cases, animals were dressed in human clothing for the process. These rituals sound absurd to modern ears, but at the time they were taken seriously. All these rules, fines, and rituals worked together to keep the social order intact. People knew who they owed work to, who could punish them, and where to go when disagreements broke out. The structure was rigid, but within that rigidity, villagers found ways to navigate, negotiate, and sometimes resist. A peasant might accept certain duties while quietly pushing back in small ways, like gathering a bit of extra wood or sharing resources informally with neighbors. Underlying the whole system was an unspoken code of local behavior. Beyond written laws and official rulings, communities had expectations about helping each other. When someone's roof collapsed in a storm, others often pitched in to repair it. During emergencies like fires or floods, people rushed to assist, not just because of friendship, but because they knew they might need that same support one day. The result was a strange mix. On one side, powerful landowners and officials with the authority to tax, fine, and punish. On the other, ordinary villagers who shared tools, traded favors, and quietly shaped their own small corner of life. Between them stood the local legal system, part performance, part discipline, part opportunity. Daily survival depended on understanding where the boundaries lay, when to follow the rules closely, and when a little bending might go unnoticed. In that sense, people living in small medieval communities were not so different from anyone trying to get by under strict systems today. They studied the patterns of power around them, watched what happened to others, and learned how to move through that landscape as safely as they could. If going to the doctor makes you nervous now, medieval medicine would have felt like stepping into a horror story with a few surprisingly smart moments hidden inside. The basic idea many learned healers believed in was simple and very wrong. They thought the body was controlled by 4 main fluids, called humours. If you got sick, it meant those fluids were out of balance. The easiest way to fix that, in their minds, was to get some of the fluid out, and the favourite target was blood. Headache? Let some blood out. Stomach cramp? Let more blood out. Feeling tired? Guess what? There are records of instructions telling doctors to remove a huge amount of blood in one session, roughly equal to several standard donations today. Some people went in for regular sessions just to stay healthy, like a medieval version of a wellness routine that nobody asked for. The fancy city doctors were expensive, so most peasants never saw them. Instead, villagers turned to local healers, wise women, and herbal specialists. These people did not always have formal education, but they had generations of experience with plants and simple treatments. Modern research into some of their recipes has shown that a lot of their herbal mixtures actually worked. Many included ingredients with natural pain-killing, anti-inflammatory, or antibacterial properties. Of course, not every remedy was a good idea. Some were harmless but bizarre. One suggestion for treating baldness involved rubbing poultry droppings on the scalp. Another remedy for toothache involved kissing a donkey on the muzzle. There were instructions to tie animal parts to the body, carry certain objects in pockets, or wear special charms to draw out illness. These treatments might not have done much for the disease, but they gave people a sense of control in a world full of danger. One treatment for headaches involved tying the body of a small animal, like a mole, to the head and wearing it for a while. Another suggested carrying a potato or similar object in a pocket until it rotted, with the idea that the sickness would move into the decaying food. Odd as these practices sound, they fit into a belief system that saw illness as something that could be pulled out, transferred, or lured away. There was another side to medieval healing that is surprisingly advanced. In some cases, healers performed surgery on the skull, a procedure known as trepanning. This meant carefully cutting or scraping a round opening in the skull to relieve pressure, treat head injuries, or address certain conditions like seizures. Archaeologists have found skulls with neatly healed holes that show the patient lived for years afterward. For a time without antibiotics, sterile tools, or anesthesia, that survival rate is impressive. Then came one of the worst health disasters in history. In the mid-14th century, a terrifying disease swept through towns and villages, killing large numbers of people in a short period. Nobody understood germs, but everyone saw that it spread rapidly and often left whole communities devastated. In response, some medical practitioners adopted strange outfits. You might recognize the image of a figure wearing a long cloak and a mask with a long bird-like beak. That beak was stuffed with herbs, spices, and pleasant-smelling materials. The idea was that these strong scents would purify the air and protect the wearer from harmful vapors. The herbs inside sometimes did have mild antibacterial effects, but they were no match for the disease itself. Some towns made serious mistakes in their attempts to deal with the crisis. In a few places, people killed or drove away cats, believing they were unlucky or connected to evil. That decision removed a major predator of rats, the very animals that helped spread the infection. Without cats to keep them in check, rats multiplied, and the situation grew even worse. Treatment methods during this outbreak were often desperate and strange. One recommended approach involved cutting open a living bird and placing it against the patient's skin, usually at the feet. The belief was that the illness would be drawn into the animal. In practice, this did nothing for the disease, but it shows how far people were willing to go in search of a cure. Color played a role in some medical theories too. Red cloth, red objects, or even red rooms might be used to treat fevers. The idea was that the right color could influence the body's balance. Patients might be wrapped in red blankets, or made to stare at red surfaces as a form of therapy. It sounds strange, but it came from a world where appearance, symbolism, and health were often tangled together. Within villages, women often served as the main caregivers. Many knew which herbs could soothe pain, help wounds heal, or calm fevers. They treated family members, neighbors, and sometimes entire communities. Some of them kept lists of plants and methods, passing knowledge from one generation to the next. Their skills could build strong reputations, but there was a risk that came with being too successful. In times of fear or misfortune, a healer who seemed unusually effective could attract suspicion. If crops failed, animals died, or storms ruined fields, jealous or frightened neighbors might accuse a woman of causing harm through supernatural means. A person who healed too well might suddenly find herself facing accusations rather than gratitude. Balancing hope and fear was a constant part of the healer's work. Surgery on the rest of the body was often handled by a different type of practitioner. Many of these surgeons also worked as barbers. The same person who cut hair, shaved beards, and pulled teeth might also set bones or remove damaged limbs. You can still see a reminder of this history in the traditional red and white striped poles outside barbershops in some places, representing blood and bandages. Without modern pain relief, speed was absolutely vital. The quicker a procedure was finished, the less time the patient had to endure agony. Historical accounts mention surgeons who could remove a limb in a matter of minutes. Another frequent operation involved cutting into the lower body to remove stones that formed in the bladder. These were incredibly painful conditions, and even though the surgery was risky, people agreed to it in the hope of relief. Not everything in their toolkit was frightening. Some of their best treatment methods were simple and effective. Honey, for example, was used on wounds to help them heal. Today, it is known that honey has natural properties that slow the growth of bacteria. People also sometimes applied old bread, with certain molds growing on it to infected areas. Without realizing it, they were using substances with early forms of antibiotic power. Setting broken bones was another area where practical knowledge paid off. Villagers knew how to straighten a limb, secure it with splints or bindings, and support it during healing. Skeletons from medieval cemeteries show many fractures that healed cleanly and correctly. That means someone took the time to line things up properly and care for the injured person through a slow recovery. For all the frightening stories, average lifespans for those who survived childhood were not as short as some myths suggest. Many illnesses struck early, and childhood was extremely dangerous. Disease, malnutrition, and accidents took many lives before adulthood. However, once a person reached a certain age and avoided the worst outbreaks, it was possible to live into the 60s or even 70s. Graveyard studies show that a portion of the adult population reached what would be considered old age. That might not sound exceptional today, but considering the lack of modern medicine and sanitation, it speaks to the strength of the human body and the adaptability of people living in harsh conditions. Daily health in a medieval village was not just about bandages and herbs. It was also about emotional resilience, shared stories, and community support. People got through sickness and recovery, surrounded by familiar faces in smoky rooms, wrapped in simple blankets, listening to prayers, songs, and small jokes that helped ease the fear. For all the backbreaking work, strict rules, and terrifying illnesses, life in a medieval village was not just an endless grind. People needed ways to laugh, relax, and forget their problems for a few hours. Free time might have been limited, but when the chance came, they knew how to turn a normal day into a celebration. The yearly calendar was packed with special occasions. Many of them were tied to religious events, but villagers treated them as chances to play games, eat better food, and simply enjoy each other's company. When the weather warmed up, one of the liveliest celebrations arrived with the beginning of May. People decorated homes and fields with greenery, flowers, and ribbons. Young men and women took part in dances on the village green, holding hands, spinning in circles, and laughing while musicians played simple tunes. In some places, a tall pole decorated with bright cloth and greenery stood in the center of the common area. Ropes or streamers hung from the top. People danced around it, weaving patterns as they moved. It was not just about music or decoration. These gatherings were a chance to flirt, show off new clothing, and meet potential partners in a setting that felt much more relaxed than the usual routines of fieldwork and chores. Sports and games had a wild energy that might surprise anyone used to organize tournaments and referees. One popular pastime involved a type of football. Instead of a tidy pitch with lines and uniforms, the playing field was the entire village. Teams might consist of anyone who joined in from a certain street or side of town. The only real aim was to get the ball to a particular area, and everything in between was chaos. Players bumped into each other, crashed into fences, and occasionally broke windows. The ball could be kicked, carried, or shoved along the ground. People stumbled through ditches and over hedges. It was messy, loud, and rough. Occasionally, the roughness got out of hand, and injuries were serious. On some occasions, authorities tried to ban the game because of the damage it caused to property and bodies. Despite that, it kept coming back because it let people blow off steam in a way nothing else did. Not every game involved that level of physical risk. Some villages had contests of strength, like wrestling or tug of war. Archery was also common, partly for training and partly for entertainment. Hitting targets at different distances turned into friendly competitions with small prizes or bragging rights for the winners. Children copied these games on a smaller scale, using smaller bows, sticks, and makeshift targets. Music wrapped itself around nearly every type of celebration. Villagers did not need complex instruments to fill the air with rhythm and melody. Simple flutes made from hollowed bones, drums made from stretched animal skin, and string instruments created an energetic background for dances and gatherings. People clapped, stamped their feet, and sang along. Songs ranged from religious hymns to cheeky verses about love, work, or mischief. Traveling entertainers sometimes visited rural communities. These performers were skilled at juggling, storytelling, playing instruments, and performing acrobatics. They became living carriers of news and jokes from distant places. Hearing someone describe life in another town or kingdom was like getting a brief window into a wider world. People crowded around them, kids peered over shoulders, and any coin or food given to these visitors felt worth the price of the show. Taverns played a big role in everyday social life. Even small villages often had at least one place where people could gather to drink ale, share news, and play games. Inside, benches and rough tables lined a smoky, crowded room. Patrons rolled dice, played early card games, or challenged each other at board games. Chess and backgammon already existed, and even if not everyone owned a set, those who did quickly attracted opponents. Drinking games added another layer of fun. A large shared cup might be passed around, and the challenge was to drink without spilling. Spill too much, and you had to drink extra as a penalty. Laughter rose as people misjudged their sips or tried to speak with their mouths full. The tavern became a place where work rank mattered a little less. Neighbours, elders, and younger adults all sat within arm's reach, exchanging stories and gripes. Weddings turned into some of the biggest parties a village could host. Once a couple had made their promises, either in front of a priest or in a simple spoken exchange, families and neighbours got to work preparing a feast. Everyone contributed what they could. One household might bring bread, another might supply ale, a third might offer a pig or chicken for roasting. Music, dancing, and games could go on late into the night, with breaks for eating and toasting the new couple. Clothing on such days became a major topic of conversation. People saved their best garments for these events. Bright colours, carefully mended sleeves, and any bits of jewellery or fine embroidery appeared, even if they normally stayed hidden in a chest. A festive event gave people a chance to show pride in themselves, their families, and their village. Dancing in a nicely decorated dress or tunic felt like stepping into a slightly different version of life, at least for a few hours. Seasonal festivals marked important points in the farming year. After a successful harvest, there might be a large communal meal to celebrate. The tables, sometimes just wooden planks set on barrels, held bread, stews, roasted meats if available, and drinks. People thanked their good fortune, laughed with relief, and tried to forget memories of leaner years. Competitions like sack races, balancing games, or mock battles with wooden weapons gave children and adults a playful outlet after months of worry over weather and crop failure. Not every form of entertainment involved noise and crowds. In the quiet of long winter evenings, families and neighbours gathered around the fire for storytelling. The dim light and flicker of flames created an atmosphere that encouraged imagination. Tales ranged from stories about saints and miracles to trickster characters, heroes, and local legends. Some stories carried lessons about behaviour and consequences. Others were simply funny, filled with misunderstandings, pranks, and clever twists. Children listened with wide eyes, memorizing details and repeating them later in their own games. Adults enjoyed the familiar rhythms of stories they had heard many times, alongside new versions that arrived from travellers or neighbouring communities. Sitting close together for warmth, sharing a pot of pottage or a crust of bread, they let words and images fill the space left by the darkness outside. Some storytelling collections became so popular that written versions eventually appeared in later centuries. At the village level, though, most stories travelled by memory alone. Each teller added little changes, shifting the setting, adding new characters, or adjusting the ending. Over time, stories blended into a rich mix of local jokes, wisdom, and folklore that would later feed into myths and fairy tales. Even quieter pastimes existed. Children played with simple toys carved from wood or shaped from clay. Small figures of animals, spinning tops, and balls made from leather scraps became treasured belongings. Jumping games, pretend battles, and imitation of adult activities filled the open spaces near homes. Drawing lines in the dirt, they invented their own rules on the spot, just as children do today. For adults, spinning wool, mending clothes, and crafting small objects could turn into social activities. Several people might sit together, hands busy with tools, while talking about everything from weather to family news. These moments blurred the line between work and leisure. Even when tasks needed to be done, doing them in good company added a layer of comfort and closeness. Taken together, all these activities gave medieval peasants something vital. They created small pockets of joy in lives that were often tough and uncertain. Laughter in a tavern, music in a field, games on the village green, and whispered stories by the fire did not erase hardship, they made it bearable. In those moments, people were not just workers or tenants. They were friends, partners, rivals in games, and keepers of shared traditions that made their world feel alive. Now let us step into a part of medieval life that everyone finds fascinating: love, marriage, and family. Forget candlelit restaurants and dating apps. Romance in a small village looked very different, but it was just as messy, funny, and complicated as anything today. Most young people did not spend years drifting from relationship to relationship. Marriage was a central goal, and it usually happened fairly early. Many young women married in their late teens or early 20s. Many young men married a little later, after they had built enough skills or resources to support a family. If a woman reached her mid-20s without a husband, people might quietly start calling her late for marriage, even if she was still perfectly capable of running a household. How did people meet partners without messaging each other on screens all day? They met where life happened. Church services were a huge part of social life, and not only for prayer. Young people watched each other across the aisle, swapped glances, and sometimes lingered outside afterward just a little longer than necessary. Village festivals, dances on the green, and group work in the fields gave young men and women excuses to talk, joke, and test each other's personalities. Flirting could be surprisingly inventive. One story from local records tells of a young man who kept losing control of his sheep, so they wandered into the land of a girl he liked. Each time, he had to go over and apologize, talk to her, and move the animals back. It was clumsy, sure, but it got him regular conversations with her. Eventually, it got him fined for damage to crops, which must have turned into an unforgettable story told for years afterward. Another recorded case describes a man who climbed up near a girl's window at night to leave flowers for her. Romantic idea. Dangerous execution. He slipped, landed in a muddy animal pen, and was caught in the mess. Romance in a medieval village clearly came with a risk of embarrassment and sometimes punishment. Families played a major role in choosing partners. Parents cared about more than affection. They looked at land, tools, animals, and the reputation of the other family. A hard-working person from a stable household could be a better match in their eyes than a charming talker with nothing to offer. One father famously refused his daughter's match because he believed the other family's poultry was inferior. That sounds absurd, but to him, strong animals meant dependable food and trade value. Chickens could actually influence a marriage decision. Even with all this family pressure, couples had more freedom than some people assume. Formal church weddings existed, but the basic core of a valid union rested on mutual agreement. If a man and woman exchanged clear promises to take each other as husband and wife, that could be considered a real marriage. No ring needed, no crowd required, though witnesses were helpful if arguments arose later. That freedom created some strange situations. Court records show cases where one person insisted that a marriage was real because vows had been spoken in private, while the other person claimed it was just a joke or said in a moment of passion. Imagine trying to convince a serious church official that saying certain words during a storm in a barn did not count as a lifetime commitment. Once a couple was recognized as married, the village took notice in a big way. Wedding celebrations were major events. People prepared for them with excitement. The bride usually did not wear a white dress. That fashion choice came much later in history. Instead, she put on her best outfit, which might be blue, green, red, or a mix of colors. The fabric might be carefully patched and repaired, but on that day, it was presented with pride. The groom also wore his finest clothing, maybe with a borrowed belt or special cloak. Friends and relatives decorated the path or doorway with greenery. Neighbors came with food and drink. Bread, pottage, ale, and whatever meat they could spare appeared on rough tables. Musicians played simple instruments while the couple led dances. The whole community treated the marriage as a shared joy, because a new household meant a stronger village network. After the celebration, everyday life for the new couple began. Many did not move into their own standalone home immediately. Instead, they often lived with a parent's family for a while, sharing space and responsibilities. That arrangement saved resources, but it also created tension. Imagine several adults, elders, and children trying to share one cooking fire, one table, and very little floor space. Arguments between in-laws were so common that they appear in legal documents. One long dispute involved who had the right to use a particular cooking pot at certain times. Another quarrel erupted over who was responsible for feeding the household poultry. Small objects, like spoons or ladles, even became symbols of authority over the kitchen. Whoever controlled them controlled the flow of food. With limited resources, ownership of such items could become a serious matter. Children entered the picture quickly in many marriages. Once they were old enough to stand and carry small items, they joined in the work of the household. At 6 or 7 years old, a child might help scare birds from crops, carry water, spin thread, or watch younger siblings. They were not treated as tiny adults, but they were expected to contribute as soon as they could. This did not mean they never played. Archaeologists have found small clay animals, carved wooden figures, and simple spinning toys that belonged to children in medieval villages. Some early feeding bottles, shaped from animal horns or pottery with small spouts, have been discovered with traces of milk inside. These objects give a glimpse of parents trying to soothe and entertain their young, even in a world filled with chores and danger. Gender roles were clear in many areas, but they were not as rigid as some people imagine. Men did a lot of the heavy fieldwork and certain tasks like ploughing. Women tended gardens, managed food preparation, spun and wove textiles, and often kept track of household supplies. However, there was plenty of overlap. Women helped with harvests and animal care. Men could sometimes be found helping indoors, especially with tasks like mending equipment or processing food. In towns and some villages, women ran their own trades. Records mention female bakers, brewers, shopkeepers, and even metalworkers. A woman might inherit a workshop or business from a husband or father, then carry it forward successfully. In some areas, a noticeable percentage of businesses were listed under women's names in tax records. They paid dues, employed others, and negotiated contracts just like their male counterparts. Marriage, while intended to be permanent, did sometimes break down. Formal divorce in the modern sense did not exist in most places, but there was a system that allowed unions to be declared invalid under certain conditions. These declarations, known as annulments, could be granted if the couple was proven closely related, forced into the match, or not fully consenting. People used this system in creative ways. Some tried to claim that they had never truly agreed to marry at all. Others accused their spouses of deception. A few excuses recorded in documents are almost comedic. One husband argued that his marriage should be undone because his wife loved a particular food too much. Another claimed that his wife had caused bad luck for the household animals, labeling her harmful to his prosperity. Not all such claims were accepted, but enough were made to show how far some people went to escape unhappy unions. Even with all the rules, expectations, and financial worries tied to marriage, genuine affection still existed. Couples carved small messages into walls, tree trunks, or wooden beams. Short notes, love symbols, and linked initials have been discovered hidden inside old buildings that later fell into ruin. A few fragile pieces of writing on bark or scraps of parchment survive, showing shy attempts at romantic expression. Flowers taken secretly from a lord's garden and left at a sweetheart's door. Small gifts of carved rings made from straw or wood. Songs whispered quietly during evening walks. These gestures hint at a side of medieval life that feels very familiar. People wanted to feel chosen, wanted, and valued, even if their world revolved around fields, livestock, and the constant threat of hunger. In crowded houses, on noisy village greens, and in smoky churchyards, eyes still met, hands still brushed, and hearts still jumped. Love did not erase hardship, but it gave people something to dream about while they walked back from the well, carried tools across fields, or stirred pots above flickering flames. To really understand village life, it helps to look at how spiritual beliefs shaped everything people did. Religion did not sit in a quiet corner of life. It wrapped around the calendar, the economy, family choices, and even fears about what happened after death. For most peasants, the local church was the biggest and most solid building they ever entered. Its stone walls and tall tower stood out among the smaller timber houses around it. Stepping inside meant stepping into a space full of carved images, painted scenes, and flickering candlelight. For people who never saw theatres, screens, or large art galleries, the interior of a church was a visual experience unlike anything else. Attending services was not simply a personal choice, it was a social expectation. Missing too many gatherings could raise eyebrows, start whispers, or attract the priest's attention. The church taught that people needed sacraments to save their souls, and the priest held the keys to those rituals. That gave him enormous influence over the community. There was also a constant financial side. Every household had to give a tenth of what it produced as a tithe. That meant if a family harvested 10 sacks of grain, one of them went to support the church. 10 eggs from the hens meant 1 egg for the church basket. It was a heavy demand on people, already stretching resources to feed their own children. And the tithe was just the starting point. Different services came with their own costs. Want your baby baptized so everyone knew the child had been formally welcomed into the faith? That required an offering, sometimes in the form of food, sometimes coins, and sometimes livestock. Preparing for a wedding meant saving not only for the feast, but also for the ceremony. Funerals needed payments too. There are accounts of families selling their last valuable animal to cover burial expenses and prayers for the dead. Religious days took up a large part of the calendar. On certain feast days, work in the fields was supposed to stop. Officially, this gave people time to attend services and focus on spiritual matters. In practice, it created tension when weather threatened to ruin crops. Imagine standing at the edge of your field, seeing black clouds roll in, knowing that cutting grain right then could save your entire food supply, but also knowing that harvesting on that day was forbidden. Records show that some peasants tried to sneak work in anyway and got caught. Fines hurt, especially when there was already a shortage of food. These situations show how tangled faith and survival could become. People believed in the importance of holy observance, but they were also staring at very real hunger if they missed critical moments in the farming year. Despite strict rules, peasants did not treat religion as a simple set of demands from above. They actively shaped how it fit into daily life. Many blended official church teachings with older folk beliefs. A family might attend Mass in the morning, kneel before the altar, and listen to sermons. Then, later that day, they might visit a local wise person who offered blessings for the fields, using herbs, charms, or spoken phrases passed down for generations. Archaeologists have found small crosses, rosary beads, and religious tokens buried alongside items like carved bone amulets or bundles of herbs. That combination suggests people wanted protection from several directions at once. If they could ask for help from both recognized saints and older spirits or forces, they would do it. For them, it was not a contradiction. It was extra security in a world full of risk. Saints occupied a special place in the mental landscape of medieval villagers. Each saint was associated with particular problems. One might be invoked for healthy crops, another for healing from illness, another for safe childbirth. Peasants treated them almost like spiritual patrons. They would light candles, say prayers, and sometimes promise future offerings in exchange for help. These promises, known as vows, could be quite specific. A person might say something like, in effect, "If my child survives this fever, I will walk to a nearby shrine and leave a share of grain. Or if the harvest succeeds, I will donate a portion of my beans." If things turned out well, people did their best to keep these promises, though sometimes payment had to wait until they had enough to spare. That delay created a sort of spiritual credit system. People borrowed blessings from saints now, planning to pay later. It shows that even in religious life, peasants thought practically. They negotiated terms in their own way, balancing belief with the reality of empty cupboards. The local priest could be a comforting presence or a source of resentment, depending on his personality and choices. Some priests were strict, insisting on every payment and threatening penalties if people fell behind. Stories survive of priests refusing to perform certain rituals until debts were cleared. In those cases, the power imbalance was obvious. Families that could not pay immediately might feel desperate, worried that their souls or their loved ones were left unprotected. Other priests showed more kindness. Some records mentioned clergy who accepted labor instead of money from the poorest parishioners. A man who could not pay coin might be allowed to work in the churchyard or help repair buildings to settle up. In communities where the priest understood how hard life really was, people remembered him with gratitude. Although the church building belonged to the religious institution, the maintenance often fell onto the villagers. When the roof needed fixing, the walls needed shoring up, or a bell tower required repair, peasants were expected to provide the muscle and sometimes the materials. That could mean days or weeks of unpaid labor, on top of the tasks they needed to do for their own farms. Refusing such work carried social and spiritual risks because it could be seen as neglecting the house of God. Visual art inside and outside church walls had a strong emotional impact. Many people could not read, so painted images, stained glass, and carved figures served as teaching tools. Scenes of heaven full of light and music contrasted sharply with depictions of tormented souls in frightening places. These images were not just decoration. They drilled messages into the minds of villagers about what might await them if they broke rules or died without making things right. Fear of punishment after death played a major role in behavior. Confession of sins, payments for candles or prayers, and attendance at services all tied into the hope of a better fate for the soul. Some people carried worries for years about small things they had done, like taking extra food during a bad season. Stories exist of individuals finally admitting old wrongs in confessional settings just to ease the fear of what might happen when they died. Yet within this rigid structure, peasants showed remarkable creativity in dealing with demands. If they could not afford regular attendance at every long service, several households might choose one person to represent them at certain events. That representative arrangement saved time and allowed others to keep working. In their view, as long as someone from the community stood in that holy space, the group was not entirely absent. People also combined religious observance with social cooperation. Feast days, when work in the fields was restricted, became chances to share meals, listen to music, and enjoy small treats. Children associated certain saints with particular foods or games. Adults used pilgrimages to shrines as chances to travel beyond their village, meet distant relatives, and trade goods. Spiritual life was not only about fear, it was also about hope, meaning, and belonging. The church bells marked time, calling people together for births, unions, and farewells. Even when they grumbled about payments or complained about a demanding priest, villagers still wanted blessings for their crops, comfort for their grief, and some promise that their hard, short lives mattered in a larger story. In smoky houses, on cold mornings, and in muddy fields, prayers rose quietly, a whispered phrase while sowing seeds, a quick sign of the cross before taking a dangerous journey, a candle lit in memory of a child who did not survive the winter. These small acts stitched spiritual meaning into daily routines. For people who lived with constant uncertainty, faith, however mixed with worry and compromise, was one more tool for holding on to hope. Picture a single day in the life of a typical peasant, and you start to see how everything you have heard about work, food, family, faith, and fun all blended together into one long pattern. The morning began in near darkness. There was no glowing screen to check, no digital alarm. People woke because the fire had died down, the air had turned cold, and faint light crept through shutters or cloth-covered openings. Roosters crowed, animals shuffled, and someone stirred the embers in the hearth to coax out a flame. The smell of smoke and last night's stew greeted everyone before they even sat up. Children slept close to parents on straw-filled mattresses or simple pallets. A quick shake, a whispered name, and the younger ones woke groggy and chilly, pulling on rough wool garments that scratched their skin but kept out the cold. Older children knew the routine already. They reached for tools, baskets, or cloaks without being told. Breakfast was not a relaxed meal with multiple choices. It was usually whatever was left from the previous day. A thick slice of coarse bread, dipped into a pot of reheated pottage. Perhaps a little piece of cheese, if the household was lucky. Small beer in a wooden cup washed it down. People ate fast, because daylight meant work, and daylight was too precious to waste. The first tasks depended on the season. In planting time, adults and older teenagers walked out to the fields, boots or simple shoes pressed into damp soil that clung to everything. Hands scattered seed from leather pouches with practiced movements, aiming for even coverage. The repetition was calming in its own way, but it also carried tension. Each handful held the hope of food months in the future. In growing season, the same walk led to long stretches of weeding. Bent backs moved slowly down the rows as hands pulled unwanted plants from the ground. Sometimes people sang to keep their spirits up, simple tunes that matched the rhythm of their movements. Short comments bounced back and forth between workers. They joked about stubborn roots or shared tiny pieces of news, like who might be marrying whom, which cow had calved, or how much the priest had complained in his latest sermon. Children too small for fieldwork had jobs closer to home. One might be assigned to guard the family's small garden patch from animals, armed with a stick and loud voice to scare away birds. Another might carry water from the well, trying not to spill any on the way back. A third might help turn a spindle, twisting wool into thread, while an adult guided their clumsy hands. By mid-morning, hunger crept back in, but official breaks did not exist. People paused when they could. A crust of bread from a cloth bundle, a swallow of drink, then back to it. For many, there was no clear line between work and rest, just moments when the body demanded a pause. The landscape around them was not silent. Birds called, insects buzzed, and the clank of metal on stone drifted over from a distant forge when the blacksmith worked. In the distance, church bells occasionally chimed, marking time in a world without clocks in every room. Those sounds reminded people that they carried obligations beyond their own survival, obligations to spiritual authorities and earthly landlords alike. As the day moved toward midday, some tasks shifted. Women returned to stir pots, bake flat loaves on hot stones, or prepare vegetables from the garden. Men might repair tools during a short break from heavier labor. Older relatives, less able to work in the fields, kept an eye on smaller children and animals, stopping fights, rescuing a wandering chicken, or soothing a crying toddler with a lullaby that had been sung for generations. Lunch, if it could be called that, was often a slightly larger portion of the same simple food. Thick stew, dipped bread, perhaps something fresh if the season allowed it. On rare days, a scrap of meat or a slice of bacon appeared at the edge of the bowl. Everyone ate from shared dishes, dipping and scooping in turn. Table manners were practical rather than fancy. There was no time or energy for delicate formality. After eating, most people went straight back to work. In summer, the sun seemed to hang forever in the sky, stretching the working hours long. The fields called them back, or the barns, or the spinning wheel, or the workshop where someone mended broken harnesses or reshaped iron hooks. Busy seasons had a particular intensity. During harvest, for example, there was an urgent race with the weather. People cut grain until their arms shook, tied bundles, carried them to carts, and stacked them high while watching the sky for any hint of a storm. Even in those busy times, small moments of connection slipped in. A shared joke, a quick song, someone calling out a humorous nickname, a child chasing a runaway goose while everyone laughed. Human warmth threaded itself through the exhausting tasks. As the sun finally dipped lower, light took on a golden color. Shadows lengthened, and the air cooled. Animals needed evening care. Someone brought cows into simple shelters, someone else tossed feed to chickens, while another person milked by hand into wooden pails. Hands that had worked soil all day now worked udders in a different rhythm, listening to the steady splash of milk, grateful for every drop that might become butter, cheese, or just a plain drink. Inside the house, the hearth came alive again. A pot bubbled with the evening meal. The smell of herbs, onions, and whatever else was available filled the cramped space. Children dozed against walls, heads drooping, only to jump awake when someone called their name. Tools were leaned against corners. A few precious objects, like a metal spoon or a piece of decorated pottery, were set carefully aside to avoid damage. The family gathered around the low table or simply sat near the fire to eat. Once bowls emptied, the real evening began. Faces relaxed, shoulders, stiff from labor, sagged a little. This was the time when stories flowed most easily. An elder might launch into a tale of times when the weather was even worse, or when a distant lord visited the region. Someone else might share a humorous story about a clumsy neighbor or an unexpected mishap in the fields. Singing often started softly, then grew as others joined in. Some songs praised saints or told tales of miracles. Others were lively tunes about young lovers, foolish decisions, or trickster characters who outsmarted authority figures. Children listened carefully, half understanding and half lost in the rhythm of the words. Repeated verses were easy to remember, so kids learned them by heart and chanted them while playing the next day. On clear nights, people stepped outside briefly before sleep. They looked up at a sky free of artificial light, crowded with stars. Without modern science, they still noticed patterns in the heavens, using constellations to mark seasons and directions. The cool air swept away some of the smell of smoke clinging to their clothes. Dogs barked in the distance, and faint sounds from other houses drifted across the village. Laughter here, a sharp scolding there, the crackle of another fire. Returning indoors, people settled down for the night. Clothes rarely changed unless they had another set. Boots or shoes might come off, but most garments stayed on to keep warmth close. Several bodies lay side by side on shared bedding, sometimes separated by rough curtains if the family had managed to hang cloth from beams for a little privacy. Darkness inside was nearly complete, once the rushlight burned out. Flickers from the last embers of the fire threw shifting shadows on the walls. In that dim space, fears and hopes grew loud in the mind. Parents thought about the next season's crops, unpaid obligations, sick relatives, and growing children. Younger people thought about someone they had watched during a festival dance, or a chance to travel with a trading neighbor, or the possibility of acquiring an animal of their own. Soon exhaustion pulled everyone into sleep. Bodies rested so that they could face another day that looked similar on the surface, yet always carried its own mix of challenges and surprises. For the people living these routines, this pattern was not an abstract history lesson. It was simply life, filled with repetition and risk, but also with small joys, companionship, and the stubborn determination to keep going. Growing up in a medieval village meant you did not really have a childhood the way people think of it now, with long years of school and separate worlds for kids and adults. Children were part of the working team from very early on, and every year of life pushed them closer to serious responsibilities. Life started with a race against time. Newborns faced real danger from infection, cold, and hunger. Families knew that many babies would not survive their first years, so there was an urgency around the first days of life. Parents wanted the child blessed as soon as possible. A quick trip to the church for baptism was not just a nice ceremony. It was a moment tied to deep fears and hopes. The baby was carried in the arms of someone wrapped in simple wool or linen, while relatives and neighbors watched closely, quietly wondering if this tiny person would make it. At home, a newborn might sleep in a small wooden cradle if the household was fortunate enough to own one. Some babies simply slept on layers of cloth near their parents. Swaddling was common. The baby would be wrapped tightly in strips of cloth so that arms and legs stayed close to the body. This made it easier to carry the child while moving around and kept the little one warm in drafty rooms where wind slipped through shutters and walls. Nights were busy. Mothers and sometimes older siblings woke often to feed, rock, and soothe the baby. There were no separate nursery rooms, no monitors, no piles of specialized equipment. A few pieces of cloth, a blanket, and someone's arms were the entire support system. Every cry echoed through a small, crowded house, where everyone shared the same air, the same smoke, and the same restless dreams. Once a child could walk without falling every few steps, life changed quickly. Toddlers tagged along while parents worked, learning where not to step and which tools were dangerous just by watching. A small stick might be handed to them as a pretend tool. They learned to copy the motions they saw every day, pretending to dig, sweep, or stir. Play and training merged into one, with imitation as the main lesson. By the time a child reached 6 or 7 years old, people expected more than pretend work. Jobs were scaled to their strength, but they were still real tasks. One child might be in charge of keeping birds away from planted seeds, clapping, shouting, and running along the edges of fields. Another might spend hours gathering sticks for fuel, learning to spot which pieces would burn well. A third might be put at a spinning wheel to twist fibers, while an adult watched for mistakes. Discipline was direct. If a child slacked off, someone noticed. Adults did not talk much about gentle motivation. They corrected with sharp words or light blows, believing that strictness kept children alive by teaching them to pay attention. With open fires, sharp tools, and heavy animals all around, carelessness could be deadly. At the same time, children were surrounded by a net of people who knew them. Aunts, uncles, grandparents, and neighbors all had opinions about how a child behaved. If a boy started fights too often, or a girl refused to help with chores, people discussed it, sometimes loudly. This constant observation could feel unforgiving, but it also meant children grew up knowing they belonged to a larger group, not just a single household. Formal schooling was rare in rural areas. Some parish priests tried to teach a few boys basic reading skills so they could assist in church or learn religious texts. For most children, knowledge traveled in other ways. They memorized prayers by hearing them repeated. They learned counting by handling grain, eggs, and coins. They picked up rules about land, animals, and tools through stories and warnings rather than written instructions. Songs and rhymes played a big part in teaching. A simple chant might help a child remember how to measure out seed or which herbs were safe. Work songs set a rhythm for shared tasks. While hands moved, voices recited practical wisdom disguised as verse. Children might not understand every meaning at first, but the words settled in their memory and resurfaced later when needed. As children approached their early teens, the path ahead started to divide. Some would remain in their parents' household and slide gradually into adult roles, taking on more intense fieldwork or domestic responsibilities. Others entered service in another household, either within the same village or in a nearby town. Working as a servant or helper in a more prosperous home gave them food, shelter, and a chance to learn new trades. Leaving home for service could be emotional. A young person might feel proud to be trusted with such a step, but also frightened at the thought of sleeping under a new roof. Parents worried too, hoping their child would be treated fairly and not overworked or abused. Still, opportunities were limited. Accepting service positions was one of the few ways to move beyond the exact economic spot a person was born into. Girls often learned a wide range of domestic skills from older women. They watched how to manage a fire, bake bread, spin wool, weave cloth, and prepare healing mixtures. Some developed real expertise in certain areas. A girl who could spin thread quickly and evenly, or bake consistently good loaves, had a valuable skill that would benefit a future household. Knowledge about childbirth and midwifery also passed largely through women, taught quietly and carefully because so much depended on it. Boys focused more on tasks like ploughing, tending animals, or working with tools, but they were not limited to those. In some villages, boys learned to repair harnesses, shape simple wooden handles, or help the local craft worker. If the village had a blacksmith, a boy might stand near the forge, sweating in the heat while learning how to read metal by sound, color, and feel. Clothing was another part of life that children picked up without any formal instruction. They saw how garments changed from season to season, and how body covering signaled status, age, and even mood. Most everyday clothing came from two main materials. Wool, from sheep, formed the base of many garments. It could be coarse or somewhat smoother, depending on how it was processed. Linen, made from flax plants, provided lighter fabric for shirts and undergarments. Making a single outfit could take many steps. Flax needed to be grown, harvested, soaked, beaten, and spun before it turned into thread. Wool had to be sheared, cleaned, carded, spun, and woven. Then someone had to cut and sew the fabric into tunics, dresses, cloaks, and hoods. That meant that every piece of clothing represented weeks or months of combined effort. People did not casually throw garments away. They patched, darned, and altered them as long as any piece was usable. Colors were not as bright or varied as synthetic dyes allow today, but they were not all dull. Natural dyes from plants, roots, bark, and sometimes insects produced shades of brown, green, yellow, and faded red. A well-dyed cloak could be a treasured possession, worn on special days and carefully folded afterward. Children often inherited clothing from older siblings. Sleeves might be shortened, hems raised, or belts tied tighter to make a too large tunic work for a smaller body. Footwear changed with the season and the household's wealth. Many children went barefoot in warmer months, toughening the soles of their feet on dirt paths and rough ground. Simple leather shoes or ankle-high boots were precious. They might be worn mostly in cold or wet weather. When they became too small for one child, they moved down the line to the next. A pair could see several owners before it finally fell apart, its leather reused as patches or straps. Keeping clean was a challenge in a world without taps, showers, or indoor plumbing. People did not wash with soap and hot water every day. Full-body baths were occasional events, more common in warmer seasons when rivers and streams were accessible. Families might set up large wooden tubs when they had time, filling them with water heated over the fire. Bathing became a shared event, with people taking turns, scooping water over themselves, and laughing at the sudden chill of cooler air afterward. More often, cleanliness focused on key areas. Hands and faces might be washed daily, especially before eating. Cloths dipped in water cleaned dust and sweat from the skin. Simple mixtures of water and ash, or rough cloth, rubbed across the teeth, served as basic dental care, even if they lacked minty flavor. Tiny pests like lice and fleas were constant enemies. People learned tricks to manage them. Hair was combed with fine teeth to pull out insects. Head coverings like caps, hoods, and veils helped keep some pests contained. Clothes were hung near heat or smoked to discourage infestation. Herbal mixtures rubbed into hair or sewn into small sachets might help repel unwanted guests, at least for a while. For children growing up in these conditions, all of this felt normal. They had no other standard to compare it to. Their sense of pride came from different measures. The first time they carried a full bucket without spilling, the day they got a garment made just for them, instead of something passed down, the moment someone trusted them to watch animals alone. In that environment, resilience grew quietly. Bodies toughened, minds adapted, and skills layered one on top of another. A child's world might have seemed small by modern standards, bounded by fields, woods, and a church tower. Yet within those boundaries, they learned complex lessons about responsibility, cooperation, and survival. It is easy to imagine medieval peasants as stuck in one place, doing the same thing every single day, but their world actually moved a lot more than it seems. Fields, tools, roads, markets, and weather all pulled people into motion. Even if someone never travelled far from home, their life still connected to a wider network of trade, technology, and risk. Tools were at the center of almost everything. Without machines or engines, simple items like plows, carts, and mills made the difference between scraping by and having a little surplus. A basic wooden plow pulled by oxen might look unimpressive, but it was the main way to open heavy soil for crops. The better it was built, the easier it moved. A loose metal tip or broken beam could ruin weeks of work. That is why the local blacksmith and carpenter mattered so much. The blacksmith shaped iron for plow blades, horseshoes, nails, knives, and hinges. The carpenter built handles, wagons, doors, and tools with wooden parts. Together they turned raw materials into a set of simple machines that multiplied human strength. When a cart rolled smoothly down a dirt track or a door swung cleanly on its hinges, it was because someone had spent hours cutting, shaping, and fitting pieces by hand. Mills were another important part of the landscape. Grinding grain by hand with small stones was slow and exhausting. Watermills and windmills, where available, changed that. A stream turning a wheel or wind spinning blades powered large grinding stones that could process a lot of grain with very little human muscle. Villagers brought sacks of harvested grain to these mills, waited their turn in line, and paid a share of the flour or grain as a fee. Mills were often controlled by the local lord or by a religious institution, which meant peasants could not just build their own and avoid the charge. Still, even with the cost, mills saved time and effort. That freed people to focus on other tasks like weaving, repairs, or extra fields. The steady rumble of a mill wheel became a familiar sound, echoing across fields and lanes. For all the usefulness of tools and local structures, people still needed to move beyond their own village sometimes. Markets in nearby towns provided access to items they could not produce themselves. A peasant might set out early in the morning, leading an animal loaded with goods or pushing a handcart. The journey could take hours along rough paths, through woods, over small streams, and past open fields. Reaching a market meant stepping into a world packed with sights and sounds. Stalls filled streets and open squares. You might find cloth, pots, knives, salted fish, dried fruit, spices, baskets, and dozens of other items piled up or hanging from hooks. Sellers called out their prices. Buyers haggled, trying to stretch their few coins as far as possible. Smells of cooking food mixed with the odors of animals, smoke, and people who had walked a long way. Money was not the only way to trade. Barter remained common. A farmer might swap surplus grain for a new pot. A weaver could trade cloth for a small knife. Coins were useful, but they were not the only measure of value. People often balanced debts and favors more informally, especially across repeated visits. A seller might say, in effect, "Pay me later when you have more eggs," trusting a familiar customer to return. Some merchants did not stay in one place. Peddlers walked from village to village carrying goods in bundles or on small wagons. They brought items that rarely appeared in local shops. Unusual trinkets, colored ribbons, polished pins, small mirrors, or simple jewelry. Children watched them with wide eyes. Adults looked more cautiously, weighing the appeal of something pretty against the reality of their limited resources. Travel had real dangers. Roads were not patrolled or lit. Outlaws and desperate people sometimes lurked in forests or lonely stretches, looking for unprotected travelers. Most peasants did not carry much of value, but even a small purse of coins or a sack of grain could tempt someone who had nothing. That is why people often traveled in groups when they could, timing their journeys to match others heading in the same direction. Weather added another layer of risk. A sudden storm could flood a track, turning it into thick mud that trapped wagon wheels. Heavy rain swelled streams, making crossings dangerous. In winter, snow and ice turned slopes into hazards. People caught far from home when conditions changed had to rely on distant shelters, like a barn at the edge of a field or the hospitality of strangers. The environment around villages was both ally and threat. Forests provided wood, berries, nuts, and game, but they also held wild animals and places where someone could vanish from sight. Wolves, though not constantly attacking, were a real concern in some regions, especially in lean winters when food for predators grew scarce. The distant howl at night carried a different weight when your animals slept in simple wooden enclosures. Rivers and streams were lifelines for water, transport, and power, yet they were also sources of danger. A child slipping on a wet bank, a cart tipping into a narrow crossing, or a sudden flood after heavy rain could turn a useful waterway into a deadly trap. People quickly learned, when and where it was safest to move near water, and passed on that knowledge in careful warnings. Climate patterns also mattered. Long periods of good weather let people believe that careful planning would keep them safe. Then, unexpectedly, a sequence of cold summers, heavy rain, or early frosts could unbalance everything. Grain rotted in the fields. Bread prices climbed as supplies shrank. Hungry people grew desperate. Villages that seemed stable suddenly faced unrest and fear. In those times, trade routes became both hope and source of anxiety. Food could be brought in from areas less affected by bad weather, but it cost more. Those who controlled supplies sometimes hoarded them to raise prices. Ordinary villagers watched strangers bring carts of grain to market, wondering if they could afford a few small sacks or if they would be pushed aside by wealthier buyers. Even when weather and trade were on their side, people had to deal with smaller but constant challenges. Simple injuries that would barely slow someone down today could become serious obstacles. A twisted ankle from stepping in a hole on a dark path might keep someone from walking to a distant field. A cut from a sharp tool could become infected, making it impossible to carry heavy loads or grip a plough. Because of that, villagers often tried to share risk. They pooled labor, swapped tasks, and made informal agreements like, "If I help you cut your grain today, you help me tomorrow." Fulfilling these small promises built trust. Breaking them damaged reputations. A person who regularly refused to help neighbors or demanded too much in return could find themselves with fewer allies when things went wrong. Over time, the habits created by tools, travel, and weather shaped the way people thought about distance and effort. A person might say that a nearby town was 1 day away, meaning not just the physical length of the journey, but the energy and supplies needed to walk there, trade, and come back. Time and space were measured in footsteps, daylight hours, and aches in the muscles rather than in miles on a map. In all of this, medieval peasants were constantly problem-solving. They looked at a broken wheel and figured out how to patch it with the wood they had. They watched the sky and guessed when it would be safe to walk through the valley. They listened to travelers and picked up hints about where prices were lower or which roads to avoid. They were not passive figures trapped in a static world. They were active participants in a system that demanded quick thinking, memory, and courage, even on what might have looked like an ordinary day. Big events in history often focus on kings, battles, and famous names. But for most peasants, those dramatic moments showed up as distant thunder that eventually rolled across their fields. They did not sit around reading news. They felt history in the ground, the taxes, and the sudden arrival of strangers. Armed men on the road were one of the clearest signs that something larger was happening. Soldiers, mercenaries, or armed retainers for a noble household did not pass quietly. They needed food, shelter, and sometimes horses. That meant they might demand supplies from villages along their route. Even if they paid for what they took, the disruption could hit hard in a place where every sack of grain mattered. When rumors of conflict spread, peasants worried less about distant politics and more about what war would do to their own land. They feared trampled crops, burned buildings, and stolen animals. A single raid could undo years of careful work. Families listened carefully to travelers at markets or at the tavern, hoping to catch hints about which areas were dangerous and which routes to avoid. Traveling church officials and preachers were another link between small communities and the wider world. When a new preacher came through, people gathered to hear stirring speeches about sin, punishment, or the need for reform. Some left feeling frightened, others inspired, and still others skeptical. These moments reminded peasants that they were part of a larger religious network that stretched far beyond their village boundaries. Not all visitors brought bad news. Some traveling craftsmen arrived with new techniques or tools. A mason might show a more efficient way to shape stone. A weaver might introduce a new pattern. Peasants were not closed off from innovation. They absorbed useful ideas and adapted them to local conditions. That is part of how farming methods, building styles, and household crafts slowly changed over time. Inside their own minds, peasants carried a mix of fear, hope, and humor. Life was uncertain, but people still found ways to think positively about the future. The promise of a good harvest, the birth of a healthy child, or the chance to acquire another animal gave them something to aim for. Small steps forward were celebrated, like adding a new pot to the kitchen, or gaining enough extra wool to trade for better shoes. Fear showed up in many forms. Bad weather, sickness, and hunger felt like constant background threats. On top of that, people worried about breaking rules, offending powerful figures, or angering spiritual forces. Omens and signs mattered. A strange pattern in the sky, an animal behaving oddly, or an unusual dream could stir anxiety. Villagers swapped interpretations quietly, trying to decide whether an event meant trouble, blessing, or nothing at all. Superstition filled gaps where clear explanations were missing. People might whisper that a certain bend in the road was unlucky because several accidents had happened there. A particular tree might be seen as special because lightning struck near it twice. Someone might believe that placing a certain plant above the door kept harmful spirits away. Whether or not these practices had any physical effect, they gave people mental anchors in an unpredictable world. Dreams were taken seriously in many households. A vivid dream involving fire, water, or lost objects might lead someone to change their plans for a day. They might delay a journey, avoid a particular path, or visit a healer for advice. Older family members often acted as interpreters, drawing on a lifetime of stories and beliefs to explain what a dream could mean. Community conflict added another layer to their emotional landscape. With people living so close together, tensions were inevitable. Someone might accuse a neighbor of borrowing tools and returning them damaged. Another might complain about animals wandering where they should not. Gossip spread quickly, turning small slights into bigger issues if not addressed. At the same time, people needed each other too much to stay angry forever. Informal networks of reconciliation existed alongside official courts. A village elder, priest, or respected neighbor might step in to calm arguments. Sharing a drink at the tavern, offering help at harvest time, or making a small gift could smooth over a bad incident. Pride had to make room for practicality. Holding a long grudge could leave someone isolated when they needed help most. Shame and honor were powerful forces. A person known for breaking promises or being lazy could find themselves quietly excluded from invitations, trade deals, or cooperative work groups. On the other hand, someone who helped generously during hard times earned a reputation that followed them for years. People remembered who brought food during a bad winter, or who stayed up late to help repair a damaged roof. Humor acted as a pressure valve. Jokes about landlords, priests, neighbors, and even themselves streamed through conversations. People used humor to talk about uncomfortable truths without starting a fight. A sharp comment disguised as a playful remark could call attention to a problem while giving everyone an excuse to laugh rather than lash out. There were also simple physical jokes, pretending to trip, exaggerating a story, or mimicking a well-known person in the village. Songs played a big part in expressing feelings. Some songs allowed people to grumble about authority in a light way, slipping criticism into catchy melodies. Others gave shape to sadness after loss or disappointment. Singing together turned private emotions into shared experiences, spreading the weight so no one carried it alone. Time itself felt different from how it feels now. Without clocks in every pocket, people marked days by the position of the sun, the sound of bells, and the changing tasks of the season. A person might say, in effect, that something happened 2 harvests ago, or in the year of the Great Frost. Their memories attached themselves to events like poor crop yields, heavy snows, or an especially joyful wedding. Life milestones stood out clearly in that flow of time. The day someone first took part in heavy fieldwork, the moment a young person left home for service elsewhere, the day a couple spoke their vows, and the time a child was old enough to carry their own tool, all became mental markers. Looking back, peasants did not think in terms of school grades or office promotions. They thought in terms of these practical and emotional transitions. Personal identity formed in the overlap between role and relationship. A person might be known as someone's child, someone's spouse, a skilled worker, or the one who told the funniest stories in winter. Their value was not measured by titles printed on documents, but by the memory of their actions in other people's minds. Late at night, when most of the village slept and only a few embers glowed in the hearth, worries often drifted through people's thoughts. Would next year be kinder than this one? Would their children survive to adulthood? Would debts be paid off and obligations fulfilled? Alongside those questions, hopes stirred. Maybe the next harvest would be good enough to buy another animal. Maybe a son or daughter would make a good match. Maybe the rain would come at the right time. Those hopes were not grand dreams of fame or distant lands. They were rooted in everyday survival and small improvements. Yet they were powerful enough to pull people out of bed in the grey light of early morning and push them back into fields, workshops, and kitchens. They were the quiet engine behind each day, turning fear into determination and hardship into something they could endure. In that sense, medieval peasants had a kind of mental toughness that is easy to overlook. They carried heavy physical loads, but they also carried constant uncertainty. They had limited information, crude medical options, and hard obligations, but they still found ways to laugh, care for each other, and imagine better days. Their emotional world was not a simple tale of misery. It was a complex mix of anxiety, faith, humour, and stubborn hope. When people picture crime in the Middle Ages, they often think of dungeons, metal cages, and dramatic executions in front of cheering crowds. The reality in most villages was a lot more practical and, in many ways, stranger. Most small communities did not have big stone prisons. Keeping someone locked up for months was expensive and pointless when every pair of hands was needed to work the land. Punishment focused on three main tools: money, shame, and pain. The goal was not long-term confinement. The goal was to make an example, clear a debt, and get the person back to being productive as fast as possible. For small offences, fines were the first option. Break a rule, damage a neighbour's property, ignore a local custom, and you might end up paying with coins, grain, or livestock. A chicken, a measure of barley, or a small purse of pennies might settle the matter. The amount hurt, but it did not destroy a family completely. People understood that a fine was both a penalty and a warning. Shame was the second tool. Stocks in the village square forced someone to sit or stand with their head and hands trapped in a wooden frame. They could not walk away. Anyone passing by saw them. Some people jeered. Others tossed scraps or insults. The punishment worked because everyone witnessed it. The memory stuck to the person long after the wood was opened, and they walked home rubbing sore wrists. There were also special devices in some places for people accused of causing trouble or disturbing the peace. A simple frame might lock someone in an uncomfortable position. A seat attached to a long beam could be used to dunk someone into water repeatedly. Being soaked and humiliated in front of neighbours stung in more ways than one. It was not just about getting wet. It was about losing face. More serious cases involved the idea of public confession. A person might be required to stand in front of the community and admit what they had done, sometimes wearing a distinctive garment or holding a symbolic object. Imagine having to walk around holding a heavy stone or wearing a sign that marked you as a liar or thief. The words spoken aloud were important. They created an official narrative. This person did this, and now it is acknowledged and dealt with. For truly dangerous crimes, like repeated theft, arson, or violent attacks, penalties could become harsh quickly. Executions did happen, though less often in remote villages than in larger towns. Hanging was a common method. The body sometimes remained on display for a while, sending a message to everyone who passed that crossing certain lines had a final price. That sounds brutal, and it was, but to people living then, it fit into a world where every decision had visible, physical consequences. There was another option: driving someone out. Being declared an outcast or outlaw essentially removed legal protection. A person in that situation could be attacked or robbed without the usual penalties applying to the offender. Losing membership in a community could be as terrifying as any physical punishment. It meant losing access to shared tools, harvest help, and mutual defense. It turned a person into prey. Not all justice came from above. Villagers also used compensation systems among themselves. If someone injured another person or killed an animal, the expected response was often to pay a fixed amount to repair the damage. These payments followed local customs that everyone roughly knew. A broken arm might have one value, while a lost cow had another. The aim was to prevent revenge from spiraling out of control. When compensation failed, grudges could turn into feuds. A single incident, like a fight at a tavern or a land dispute, might echo for years. Families could end up on opposite sides of a conflict that felt bigger than the original issue. People avoided certain paths or gatherings to dodge rivals. Marriages between feuding groups became tense or impossible. Community leaders spent time and energy trying to heal these rifts, because an angry village was a vulnerable village. In some areas, trials used a method that sounds almost like something from a dark fantasy story: ordeals. When human testimony and evidence were not enough, people turned to rituals they believed would reveal truth by calling on divine judgment. One kind involved hot objects. A person might have to carry a piece of heated iron for a few steps, or place their hand in boiling water to retrieve something. The wound would be bound and checked later. If it healed cleanly, some people interpreted that as a sign of innocence. If it festered, it could be seen as guilt. Another type of ordeal used water. The accused might be bound and lowered into a body of water. If they sank and had to be pulled out quickly, some saw that as water accepting them, a sign of innocence. If they floated, others believed that meant rejection, a sign of guilt. Modern minds see all the random chance involved. For the people then, it felt like asking a higher power to make the call when human judgment could not. Alongside these dramatic methods stood the quieter world of oaths. Swearing to tell the truth carried serious weight. A person might be asked to bring others to swear that they believed them. If they could gather enough supporters willing to place their hands on sacred objects and speak formal words, it strengthened their case. Refusing to swear or failing to find supporters made someone look suspicious, even if no physical evidence existed. In legal settings, words mattered so much that people turned them into careful formulas. Phrases repeated in the same way, in the same order, turned simple statements into official actions. A person giving up a claim to land, admitting a debt, or accepting a punishment did so in front of witnesses with specific wording. That gave everyone a shared memory of what had been said. In a world with limited writing, spoken formulas, and the community's ears acted as the archive. Curiously, animals sometimes appeared in this system as more than property. In rare but striking cases, animals that caused harm were dragged into symbolic trials. A pig that injured a child might be treated as if it were a human offender, paraded, judged, and punished. These actions were not common daily occurrences, but they show how strongly people believed that justice needed to be seen being carried out, even if the accused could not understand a single word. Beneath all this, there was constant negotiation between strictness and mercy. Villagers did not want to live in a place where every mistake ended in devastation. At the same time, they feared what would happen if rules collapsed. So, officials and local leaders weighed factors like the person's past behavior, their family's reputation, and the seriousness of the impact. A known hard worker who made a single mistake might get more lenient treatment than someone already marked by repeated problems. Children saw all of this. They watched people standing in the stocks. They heard about fines and feuds, ordeals and oaths. Those sights and stories taught them where the invisible lines lay. Even without a written law code, they understood that certain acts would be remembered for a long time. The fear of embarrassment, loss, and punishment shaped their choices as much as hunger or tiredness did. In that kind of environment, self-control became a survival skill. People learned when to hold their tongue, when to back down from an argument, and when to involve someone more respected to mediate. They practiced reading expressions, spotting rising tension, and steering conversations away from dangerous topics at the tavern. This social navigation was a quiet form of intelligence that rarely shows up in heroic tales, but it kept the village functioning. Justice in a medieval peasant community, then, was not a tidy system with perfect fairness. It mixed fear, tradition, community approval, and practical needs. Some people suffered more than they should have. Others slipped away from consequences through luck or influence. And yet, through all its flaws, the system managed to keep most people cooperating just enough to plough fields, raise homes, and survive another year together. There is one part of peasant life that quietly shaped everything they did, but does not get talked about enough. What it meant to grow old, face death, and be remembered. Getting older in a medieval village was not guaranteed. Many people died in childhood, during sickness outbreaks, or from accidents, so reaching an age where hair turned grey and joints stiffened was already an achievement. Elders carried a special kind of weight in the community. Their bodies might slow down, but their memories, stories, and experience were incredibly valuable. Work did not stop just because someone could not swing a scythe all day anymore. Older men and women shifted into different roles. Instead of ploughing heavy soil, they might watch younger children, tend small animals close to home, or manage the garden. They sorted grain, carded wool, repaired clothing, or sharpened tools. These tasks might look small from the outside, but they freed up younger, stronger bodies to handle the rougher jobs. Elders often acted as living libraries. They remembered which corner of a field stayed dry during a flood year, which plants helped a certain illness, and which families were trustworthy trading partners. When weather looked uncertain or a new problem appeared, people asked older neighbors what had happened the last time something similar arose. That long memory helped villagers avoid some repeated mistakes and gave them a feeling of continuity when everything else felt fragile. Grandparents, in particular, shaped how children saw the world. While parents focused on immediate survival, planting, feeding, and mending, grandparents had a little more time to talk. They told stories that mixed personal experience with legend. A tale might start with a year of deep snow or a strange traveling preacher, and end with a lesson about patience, caution, or generosity. Sitting beside a fire, children watched the wrinkles on a grandparent's face move as they spoke, linking wisdom and age together in their minds. Old age also came with vulnerability. A body that had spent decades lifting, bending, and walking did not cooperate so easily. Knees ached, back stayed stiff. Fingers crooked from arthritis struggled with delicate tasks. In a world without painkillers beyond simple herbs and alcohol, that discomfort was a constant background presence. Yet most elders kept going, adjusting how they moved and finding ways to contribute despite the pain. Respect for elders was not simply about politeness, it was practical. A village where older people were ignored or mistreated risked losing crucial knowledge. People who lived through famines, floods, and disease had a better sense of how far food could be stretched, how to store water safely, and when to start worrying about certain signs in the environment. Their advice might not be perfect, but it was often grounded in hard-won experience. Death itself showed up often enough that people had a more direct relationship with it than many do now. Even a simple illness could become serious quickly. There were no ambulances, no hospitals, no quiet white rooms full of machines. When someone grew weak, they stayed in the same house where they had lived, surrounded by the same smoke, the same tools, and the same faces they had seen every day. Family members tended to the dying person as best they could, washing their face, spooning small amounts of food or drink to their lips, adjusting blankets, and speaking softly. Neighbors might come to sit for a while, offering comfort to the family. The local healer tried what remedies they knew. The priest arrived to perform last rites and offer prayers, giving spiritual reassurance even when physical hope had faded. Children saw all of this. There was no way to shield them from death in small homes where everyone slept in the same room. They listened as adults whispered about the person's condition, watched as relatives cried quietly, and sometimes held a hand that grew colder and weaker. Death was frightening, but it was also a visible part of life, not hidden away. When someone passed, the body was washed and prepared by relatives or neighbors. Special garments, often the best clothing the person owned or set aside for this moment, were put on. The body might be laid out in the house for a short time so people could come and say goodbye. Candles burned nearby if the household could afford them, their small flames flickering against the walls. The funeral brought more formal structure. The body travelled to the churchyard, carried on a simple bier or in a rough coffin if one was available. The priest led prayers, speaking words that villagers had heard their entire lives about sin, forgiveness, and rest. People stood with heads bowed, feeling the weight of their own fears and memories pressing in around them. Burial grounds near churches grew layer upon layer of graves over the years. Simple wooden markers decayed with time. Stone markers, where they existed, stayed longer, but were usually reserved for wealthier individuals. Many peasants lay in unmarked or barely marked spots, their exact resting places lost over generations. Yet the community remembered them in other ways. People referred to fields, paths, or corners of the village by the names of those who had once lived nearby. Death also changed the economic and social shape of a household overnight. If the person who died was a main worker or head of the family, questions arose quickly. Who would take over their strip of land? Who would manage the animals? Could the surviving spouse handle both child raising and fieldwork? Landlords and local courts sometimes became involved, especially when inheritance rights were unclear or disputed. Widows and widowers had to navigate a new, difficult path. A widow might stay in the household, managing what she could, and relying on older children or relatives for heavier labor. In some cases, she remarried, joining another household or bringing a new partner into her old one. A widower with young children faced equally complicated choices. Taking another spouse could mean more help, but it also meant reshaping family relationships. Communities often stepped in informally to help families hit by death. Neighbors might assist with harvest work, share food, or lend tools so that a household did not collapse completely under the strain. These acts of support were not always purely selfless. People understood that keeping a neighbor afloat helped maintain the strength of the entire village. If one house failed, more pressure fell on everyone else. Beliefs about what happened after death colored how people grieved. They worried about the state of the soul, hoping that proper rituals and prayers could ease the person's path. They feared the idea of dying without confession or outside the favor of religious authorities. At the same time, they took comfort in thinking their loved ones might still watch over them in some way, listening to prayers or seeing the family's efforts to honor their memory. Anniversaries of deaths and special days for the dead gave families chances to reconnect with their feelings. Lighting a candle, saying a prayer, or speaking a name out loud kept the person present in the family story. Children grew up hearing about grandparents they had never met, learning to slot those figures into their inner picture of what their family was. Skulls and bones sometimes appeared as visual reminders in church art and decoration. These images were not meant to shock in the way modern horror stories do. They were meant to remind people that every human, regardless of wealth or power, eventually reached the same end. For peasants who faced that reality constantly, the message felt both sobering and oddly equalizing. Even in the face of death, humor did not completely disappear. People sometimes made wry remarks about their own fate, joking that they would haunt someone who failed to pay a debt, or that they wanted to be buried with a particular object. These jokes softened the fear slightly, turning something overwhelming into something they could at least talk about. Old age, dying, and burial might sound like dark topics, but in a medieval peasant community, they were woven right into the daily fabric, sitting beside work, food, and celebration. Knowing how fragile life was did not always crush people. In some ways, it sharpened their appreciation for the moments they did have. A shared joke, a good harvest, a child's laugh, and a peaceful evening by the fire. Those small pieces of joy carried a different weight when everyone understood how easily they could vanish. And that understanding gave medieval peasants a kind of grounded outlook that still speaks quietly through the traces they left behind in fields, graves, and stories. If you could walk into a medieval village for just one day, you might be surprised by how familiar parts of it would feel, even through all the mud, smoke, and noise. It is easy to imagine peasants as completely different from us, but in many ways they were facing the same basic questions. How do I feed my family? Who can I trust? What happens if my world suddenly changes? Our view of them is built from bits and pieces. Old documents, damaged buildings, broken tools, and skeletons dug from the ground act like puzzle pieces. A rent record listing who owed grain tells us who lived where and how much they produced. A set of worn-out shoes found in the earth shows us the shape of their feet and how far they walked. Pollens trapped in soil layers reveal what crops grew in nearby fields. Each clue is tiny. Together they rebuild a world. Sometimes those clues overturn modern myths. For a long time, people pictured peasants as constantly filthy, never washing and never caring about their surroundings. Yet combs, washing basins, and even simple grooming tools show up often in digs. Laws and sermons from the time scold people for spending too much effort on clothing and hair. That is a hint that they did care about appearance. They might not have had hot showers and scented shampoos, but they had their own standards for what counted as tidy and respectable. Another mistaken picture is that peasants were dull and uneducated in every sense. Formal schooling was rare, yes, but memory and observation trained their minds in different ways. A farmer who knew exactly when to plant, based on the feel of the air, the moisture in the soil, and the look of the sky, carried knowledge that came from years of focused attention. A craft worker who could judge metal temperature by color or knew when dough was ready only by touch had a highly tuned sense for their task. They might not have written essays, but their skills were real and complex. Language itself was rich and creative. Jokes, proverbs, and nicknames filled conversations. People invented little sayings about weather, animals, and behavior that helped them remember patterns. Many of those sayings survived in altered forms, buried in later traditions. Every time someone uses an old proverb about time, patience, or hard work, they might be echoing a thought that once bounced around a smoky hall in a small village. Peasants also had more awareness of the outside world than many assume. Traveling merchants, clergy, and laborers carried news from other regions. Word spread about strange events like distant earthquakes, unusual eclipses, or new royal decrees. They did not have maps or newspapers, but they built mental pictures of the wider world from stories and travelers. These mental maps were patchy and sometimes inaccurate, Yet they gave people a sense that beyond their fields lay other fields, other villages, other lives. The natural world pressed hard on them in ways that modern technology often softens for us. A bad storm for them was not just an inconvenience that delayed a commute. It could flatten grain, drown seedlings, or topple a storage building. Snow that lingered too long might kill livestock. Drought cooked the soil into dust. Yet people watched these patterns closely and looked for signs that might help them predict what came next. Sunrise colors, animal behavior, and plant growth pointed toward wet or dry seasons in their minds. They did not simply endure nature. They altered it in quiet but permanent ways, clearing forests for fields, draining marshy land for pasture, and building terraces on slopes changed landscapes for centuries to come. Hedgerows planted to mark property lines became long, winding habitats for birds and insects. Footpaths pressed into dirt by generations of feet gradually turned into recognizable routes that later travelers and even modern roads followed. Inside their own homes, peasants experimented constantly. They tried new ways to store grain, different recipes for preserving vegetables, and improved methods for repairing walls and roofs. A successful trick spread quickly. If one family found that a particular herb kept pests away from stored beans, others would test it. Little improvements quietly spread through communities without anyone writing them down. Visiting a village across several decades would show a slow but real evolution. Houses might grow slightly larger or gain better roofs. Tools could change shape as blacksmiths refined designs. Clothing styles would shift as different cuts or colors became popular. Even language would change, with new words replacing old ones. It was not a frozen world fixed in time. It was a moving river, just flowing at a different speed from the rapid changes we are used to now. Peasants also developed ways to handle emotional strain together. Singing in groups, holding regular gatherings, and sharing stories served as outlets for fear and frustration. A rough joke at the tavern about a greedy landlord might not change the tax rate, but it let people express anger in a somewhat safe way. A shared song about brave farmers facing harsh winters turned collective hardship into something they felt less alone in. The sense of belonging to a group was strong. A person knew which families lived in which houses, who had recently married, who was in trouble, and who could be counted on in a crisis. That depth of local knowledge created a thick web of social ties that both supported and constrained everyone. You could not simply reinvent yourself with a new hairstyle and a move across town. Your childhood mistakes, your family reputation, and your history of keeping promises followed you everywhere. Modern life offers more chances to start over, yet it often lacks the solid sense that everyone around you knows you deeply. That is something peasants would probably find confusing about the present world. How someone can pass hundreds of strangers every day and still feel lonely. They might envy our comfort, but they might also wonder what it feels like to live with so much anonymity. When we compare our lives with theirs, it is tempting to turn the whole past into either a nightmare or a romantic fantasy. It was neither. Medieval peasant life was a combination of grinding difficulty and genuine warmth. The same person who spent 10 hours bending over a field might spend the evening laughing so hard at a story that tears ran down their face. The same hands that dug through cold mud could also gently braid a child's hair or carve a toy from a scrap of wood. What they had in abundance was clarity about what mattered. Food, shelter, health, and social ties were not abstract notes in a textbook. They were visible, fragile things that could be lost in a single bad season. That gave each small success a sharp sweetness. A full grain bin, a healthy newborn, a repaired roof that kept rain out during a storm, a friendly hand offered after a quarrel. These were victories. Looking at their lives does not mean we should romanticize hardship or pretend that suffering is noble. It does, however, highlight the strength people can find in community, in practical skill, and in simple routines. It shows how much can be built with very little material wealth when knowledge, effort, and cooperation come together. If a medieval peasant could see our world, with its lights, screens, medicines, and stocked stores, they might think we live like royalty. At the same time, they might be puzzled by how often we feel isolated, stressed, or overwhelmed by choices that have little to do with survival. They might ask why, with so many tools to make life easier, people still struggle to feel satisfied. In the end, their story is not just about the past. It is a reminder that human beings can adapt to almost anything. They can work through long stretches of difficulty, celebrate tiny joys, and hold on to hope even when the odds look terrible. Medieval peasants did not leave behind long journals or detailed videos about their feelings. They left furrows in old fields, smoke stains on old beams, healed bones, worn tools, and quiet traces of song and laughter in the stories that survived. When we pay attention to those traces, we are not just learning about how they lived. We are also seeing another version of ourselves, stripped of gadgets and shortcuts, standing in a field with bare hands and a stubborn belief that tomorrow might still be worth getting up for.